All right, it's 12 o'clock. It's Wednesday. That means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and faculty affiliate with the Iowa Learning Farms program. It's my great pleasure to get to moderate the webinar today, and really excited for this topic, really important topic. So we have Dr. Dani Winter Lay coming to us from Purdue University. Dani's an ecological engineer and extension specialist with Purdue University. She's going to talk to us today about improving water quality outcomes with more strategic floodplain restoration. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dani. And
Perfect.
as
Thank you for,
always, excuse me, as
yeah,
always, I'll put it in the chat box as well. If you have questions, please type those in the chat box. I'll put that, as I said, in the chat box as well. Sorry to interrupt you. Now the virtual floor is all yours.
no problem. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you all today and share some of the work that we've done here at Purdue over the last couple years to figure out how do we design and restore floodplains to treat even more nitrogen. We know they're a great ecological engineering practice to reduce nitrogen export, but how can we really make more strategic investments into floodplain restoration to maximize that nitrogen treatment? So one of our big environmental quality challenges in the Mississippi River Basin is excess nitrogen, particularly in the form of nitrate in our surface and groundwater. We're one of the most agriculturally productive regions of the world here in the Mississippi River Basin. Lots of corn production, also increased production of nitrogen fixing crops. We have increased development over the last century, as well as just more intensive agriculture. And that's led to a lot more nitrogen entering into our waterways. We need that fertilizer to support that agricultural production. And so we see a lot more export or supply of nitrogen. In synchrony with that increasing supply of nitrogen, we've also reduced the natural capacity of the landscape to treat excess nitrogen. As we've ramped up agricultural production, we've drained wetlands across the Mississippi River Basin to support that production. And that was a key sink for our nitrogen. Along with that land use change, we've also disconnected floodplains from their rivers. We see less flooding in floodplains and typically deeper groundwater tables due to levees, artificial drainage, as well as increased sedimentation. So we have this higher supply and lower demand in the landscape, which leaves us with a lot more nitrogen across our waterways. That has ecological implications, as I'm sure you've heard about in the Gulf of Mexico, but there are also human health and economic implications of that excess nitrogen. And so one ecological engineering, more nature-based solution to that excess nitrogen is restoring that hydrologic connection between floodplains and their rivers. In this graphic, the top represents a lot of our floodplains in the Midwest, leveed. We might be using them for agriculture. They might have artificial drainage, so we don't have those shallow water tables and we have less frequent flooding. On the bottom, we have a restored floodplain. We might remove that levee or set it back to increase that flood frequency, start to excavate the floodplain down, maybe add bypass channels or remove artificial drainage. We may even go a step further, add back native vegetation, and add in different geomorphic features like depressional wetlands as we restore these floodplains. The challenge here is we do have some external pressures to think about. Models show that we need a lot of wetland area and a lot of floodplain area to be restored to meet some of our target reductions of nitrogen for the Mississippi River Basin. But with that demand for land to be restored, we have competing land uses of agricultural production and other things going on in floodplains, and we also have restoration cost. And moving forward, we have to think as land managers and restoration practitioners to balance these different considerations, that when we're restoring floodplains, we really want to maximize how much each floodplain can remove of that excess nitrate. So increase the removal rate in hopes that we can use a little bit less land and reduce that restoration cost as well as opportunity cost. So really figuring out that optimization piece. And when we're thinking about floodplain nitrogen removal, denitrification is the process that we chose to focus on. It's a primary path for nitrate removal in these systems because they often support the ideal conditions for this microbial process. Denitrification is also a process that we kind of see as one of the most optimal pathways to reduce nitrogen that's in our groundwater and surface water. Microbes end up taking that excess nitrate and hopefully converting it all the way to nitrogen gas. That makes up most of our atmosphere anyways, so it's an end product we can be pretty happy with. And from decades of research, we know a lot about what's required to support denitrification, the more fundamental requirements. We know we need the microbes that are able to carry out this process. We need the nitrate as well as organic matter to power this process, and then oxygen also needs to be gone. While we understand these fundamental conditions, these can be abstract when it comes to designing and managing floodplains. If I say, okay, let's design the floodplain for 10% organic matter, it's not necessarily clear how we get there. But what's more actionable guidance is, okay, implement this type of plant to increase denitrification, or you should target so many days of flooding per year, or flood duration of so long. And so that actionable guidance can help us satisfy these fundamental conditions, but we can act on it and get closer to those conditions through some of those design and management choices. And that's where our work comes in. We really want to understand how design and management actions and different plot and field scale environmental properties that we can manipulate with site selection, design and management relate back to denitrification and some of those fundamental requirements for denitrification. So we worked on evaluating different design approaches for these floodplains. Do we just need that hydrologic connection restored, or do we also need native vegetation in these wetland environments? What level of investment do we need? And then the second piece is looking at what environmental properties predict denitrification, and can we identify the range of these properties where denitrification is heightened, and then we can design for that range of properties. And how we did this was evaluating existing floodplains in the Wabash River Basin. This is a good model for the Mississippi River Basin. It is a watershed located mainly in Indiana with a lot of row crop production. It has an outsized nitrogen contribution as compared to its drainage area. And we looked at 4 floodplains about 20 minutes north of Purdue University and Prophetstown State Park as different models. So similar climatic setting, somewhat similar geologic setting, where what is changing is the design approach to these 4 floodplains. And this was along the Wabash River at the confluence with the Tippecanoe River, one of the major tributaries. And these floodplains represent a gradient of intervention. At kind of the lowest level of intervention, where we're really focusing on the opportunity cost of agricultural production, we have a floodplain that is allowed to flood during those high flows in the spring and winter, and then during the growing season is farmed in a corn-soybean rotation. So that might mean planting a little bit later, or some wetter areas don't get planted every year, but we're trying to see, can we get that nitrogen treatment outside of the growing season and still have that agricultural production? The next step up on our gradient of intervention is putting floodplains into conservation. So reestablishing native prairie vegetation, but with these floodplains, there weren't major structural modifications to increase that flood frequency or raise those groundwater levels. So hydrologic connection wasn't changed. And then on the far end, kind of our most intensive investment is first putting this site into conservation, and then later really making some modifications to the structure of the floodplain to increase flood frequency and have shallower water tables, and also adding in some geomorphic heterogeneity, so adding depressional wetlands and other features into the system. And how we looked at this is sampling across these floodplains to figure out how these design approaches impacted denitrification. But within these floodplains, we tried to establish sampling locations to touch on a variety of environmental conditions to see how hydrology, depth, soil type, and geomorphology might also impact denitrification. So in these floodplains and across these locations, we measured the target function we were looking at. Over the course of this study, we evaluated a number of different water quality functions, but today I'm just going to focus on denitrification in the top 0 to 10 centimeters of soil, which was where we saw the highest nitrate removal potential. And in talking about denitrification, we characterize denitrification with denitrification enzyme assays, and we kind of have 2 groups of those. The first are ambient denitrification. That is adding in river water or regular water. That's kind of looking at the background of what happens when this system floods, what sort of level of denitrification might we see. We also had another set of samples where we added more nitrate and a lot more carbon to kind of stretch the higher end and see what potential they might have if all the resources they need are available. And concurrently with measuring that target function, we also characterize potential predictors of denitrification. I've kind of grouped those in the graphic on the right into different larger umbrellas, but we evaluated a number of predictors within each one of those. Most can be impacted by design and management, and some we can't control, like the seasonal differences in weather. And once we have the functional outputs of this floodplain, as well as potential predictors of those functions, we use statistics to link those, figure out which strategies support the highest denitrification, and also which environmental properties predict denitrification the best. Once we understand that, we figure out what environmental conditions are associated with that high function, in this case, high denitrification rates. From there, we try and figure out which properties can we actually adapt to with our site selection, design, and management. And then from there, we make recommendations about how to get the most denitrification out of these floodplains with that site selection, design, and management. So I'll cover a couple of highlights today. Feel free to reach out if anything is of interest or some of those other functions really are of focus in what you're working on now. But highlights, the first one is organic matter supply was really a primary control in these systems. And when we think about the design and management implications, we're able to link that to the reestablishment of native vegetation. And then second, I'll talk about more secondary controls of the degree of hydrologic connectivity and the nitrate supply. So jumping into these differences in design approaches, we saw that the farm floodplain had a much lower capacity to remove nitrate than the other design approaches. That farm floodplain only supported about 20% of the denitrification capacity as the floodplains that were restored with native vegetation. So native vegetation is the key difference here. Because of the hydrologic connectivity of that farm floodplain, it actually, by most of our metrics, was wetter than the prairie floodplains. So we really see and focus in on that native vegetation reestablishment as the difference. The other thing we saw, in addition to lower rates of denitrification, even when we gave the agricultural soils more nitrate and very bioavailable carbon, they didn't really respond, sort of indicating that the microbial community may not be robust enough to respond to fresh inputs. So we have low rates as well as a low potential to treat nitrogen. And we wanted to dig in and understand what is this difference between the systems with row crop agriculture versus native vegetation, and kind of why might we see the difference in denitrification. We used a machine learning technique called boosted regression trees to try and understand what explains denitrification, and vegetation, soil properties, and seasons were some of the best predictors of denitrification in that top 0 to 10 centimeters. Focusing in on vegetation, vegetation was the best predictor of denitrification based on this model. And we started to contrast the lower performing vegetation that supported low denitrification versus the higher performing denitrification plants. And what we see is the lowest performers tended to be associated with that row crop management, corn, soy, and unvegetated soils. The intermediate performers in terms of vegetation were typically found in the 2 prairie floodplains, and then our highest performing vegetation tended to be found in the wetland floodplain. So we can see that the higher performing vegetation tends to be those native wetland and prairie types versus the agricultural vegetation has that lower denitrification. We also dug into the soil properties because they emerged as key predictors. And this technique of linear discriminant analysis showed that the agricultural soils tend to be somewhat different from the prairie soils and the wetland soils. Again, that native vegetation piece seems to impart different soil properties. And we kind of see the purple is our agricultural soils. It clusters farthest from our wetland soils, so our more intensive restoration, and our light touch restoration of the prairies have intermediate denitrification function, as well as intermediate soil properties. And one key property that emerged in differentiating the agricultural soils versus the floodplains with native vegetation was the organic matter content. The agricultural floodplain tended to have lower organic matter content than the prairie and wetland floodplains with that native vegetation. And going back to our results, organic matter content was the second best predictor of denitrification. And what this plot tells us is that the more organic matter we have, we typically see higher denitrification. So that lower organic matter in the agricultural floodplain is likely explaining that lower denitrification function. So in addition to lower organic matter in the agricultural floodplain, we also saw lower soil nitrogen. So going back to those fundamental requirements, organic matter and nitrogen are two things that we need, and they're not really showing up under agricultural management. We also saw that when there was organic carbon in that agricultural system, it tended to be less bioavailable than the organic matter in the systems with native vegetation. We saw more microbial humic-like C in the agricultural system. That tends to be harder for microbes to digest and use. And we saw more protein-like carbon in the native vegetation systems. That tends to be easier for those microbes to use as well. And to kind of put it in a metaphor, especially as we're approaching Halloween with candy, that more digestible protein-like organic carbon is a lot like Skittles. It's quick sugar energy that gets you moving, perhaps, although there might be a crash later. So we see that more digestible, readily accessible in the floodplains with native vegetation. Where in the agricultural floodplain, we see carbon that's maybe harder to break down. I liken this to Brussels sprouts. Probably good for you at the end of the day, but it might take more energy to break down. And so it may inhibit the microbes a bit in trying to remove some of that nitrogen. And in addition to having less organic matter, less bioavailable organic matter, we also saw that in this particular agricultural floodplain, soils were coarser. We saw higher sand, lower silt, and that sand content, it can be hard for organic matter to stick around in that system. So in addition to having maybe less supply as crops are being extracted each year, it's harder for remaining organic matter to stay in the system given the soil texture. And when we look at our range of soil organic matter and then its relationship to denitrification, we really see that in these systems, denitrification starts to take off above about 6% organic matter on a mass basis. The challenge is in most agricultural systems, the range of organic matter tends to be below that. So potentially with the extraction of crops each year, the supply of organic matter just may not be replenished enough to support high denitrification in these farmed floodplains. In addition to supporting those lower rates, we also saw the farm floodplains just couldn't respond to incoming nitrate and bioavailable carbon like the floodplains with the native vegetation. And our thought there is that not only do you need the organic matter to power denitrification in the moment, you need sufficient organic matter to develop a microbial community that's going to be primed and ready to respond when nitrate comes in. So it's not only the rate, but the potential is limited in these farm systems. And a key difference between the farmed floodplain and the floodplains with native vegetation is that soil organic matter. But even in the restored systems, we see organic matter supply is really important. Nitrate was the primary limitation of denitrification in these systems, but we found when very bioavailable organic carbon, that more skittle carbon, was supplied, we see jumps in denitrification. And so this plot here shows denitrification with no additions, with carbon and nitrogen, and then with nitrogen. And we see a jump when we add nitrogen to these systems where they're responding to it. And we see just a bit more function when we add that organic carbon. So it's still important, even when you have native vegetation, to be supplying labile organic carbon to these systems. Vegetation was kind of a key explanatory factor in contrasting the farm system versus the native vegetation. But even within the native vegetation, we see differences in denitrification across vegetation types. When we started contrasting the highest performing vegetation in terms of denitrification, we saw this vegetation also tended to have the highest levels of organic matter in the underlying soil. So we can start to see there may even be vegetation types that we can plant to further boost organic matter in these systems with native vegetation and thereby increase denitrification further. So from this first point of organic matter being a primary control, we have a couple recommendations that come from this about more strategically restoring floodplains to maximize that denitrification. The clearest one is reestablishing native vegetation supplies organic matter that's likely needed to boost denitrification. Farming these systems doesn't seem to supply enough organic matter to really get that nitrogen treatment if that's your primary goal in restoring a floodplain. Another recommendation is that it might be helpful to pick sites where organic carbon stocks are still in place and haven't been depleted too much by past land uses. So if you have a choice between sites and there's one with more organic matter, potentially that could be a positive choice when you're looking for enhanced nitrogen treatment. And then last piece is even when you're restoring native vegetation, you might want to focus on also supplying more bioavailable organic carbon to the system to further increase denitrification. This might be done with vegetation selection or even organic carbon amendments. And then moving on to the secondary control of the degree of hydrologic connectivity and nitrate supply. Our finding was that greater hydrologic connectivity tended to increase denitrification even more, and these systems are limited by nitrate supply. So the big recommendation there is restoring floodplains as wetlands with frequent nitrate delivery is going to get even higher denitrification potential. So our biggest difference was that difference between the agricultural floodplain and the ones with native vegetation. But we do see between the prairies and the wetland floodplain tends to support even higher denitrification. When we started looking within some of the floodplains, the most hydrologically connected geomorphic features tended to support the highest levels of denitrification. You might note that the prairie floodplain along the Wabash looks somewhat similar in function to the wetland floodplain. In that particular prairie, there was a natural seepage wetland that formed, and sampling sites within that wetland and around it tended to push up denitrification a bit as well. So again, co-occurring that highest denitrification rate in areas where we have wetland hydrology. These wetland features were also very responsive to nitrate and organic carbon additions. So when there is a flood, these soils tend to be primed to respond to incoming nitrate and are able to treat it better than less connected features. The challenge here is we characterized a range of predictors of hydrologic connectivity, but they didn't necessarily align with denitrification. So in advising practitioners and land managers, we wanted to have more clear guidance on how much connectivity do you need to have higher denitrification. And we used a number of different metrics I have listed here. And again, none of them aligned with denitrification very well. Our metrics were built from digital elevation models as well as a 2D HEC-RAS model, and they were focused a bit more on surface connectivity. The challenge that we saw is that there were some features that our hydrologic connectivity metrics showed to be dry, even though when we were out in the field, we saw persistent ponding or high water tables throughout the year. And kind of our thought is we need better predictors to link hydrologic connectivity to denitrification. We know more hydrologic connectivity tends to be better based on the co-occurrence of high denitrification in wetlands, but a more quantitative link of hydrologic connectivity is not something we were able to look at. Subsurface connectivity might be part of the reason. We couldn't really track some of these systems with high groundwater level. It might also be a challenge with spatial resolution as well. So hydrologic connectivity seems to explain, but our particular metrics fell a little bit flat when it came to linking them quantitatively to denitrification. What we were able to do is link soil properties that are also associated with differences in hydrologic connectivity to denitrification. So organic matter is driven by hydrologic connectivity. We saw that high organic matter tends to be associated with higher denitrification. Soil texture is also moderated by hydrologic connectivity. Siltier soils tended to support high higher denitrification. We also saw soil moisture as a key predictor, where more persistent soil moisture was associated with higher denitrification. And then we had some mixed evidence that some of the systems that were more hydrologically connected had higher sedimentation, which could maybe support higher denitrification. Another thing too is vegetation was that key predictor that helped us better understand what's going on between the agricultural floodplains and the floodplains with native vegetation. But vegetation also tracked with soil moisture. We saw that some of the vegetation that tended to be in the wettest areas also tended to be vegetation that had high denitrification rates. So it seems like vegetation could be a proxy for that and also provides yet another link between denitrification and that increased hydrologic connectivity. And then with our restored floodplains, we saw that they had an even higher capacity to treat nitrate than is actually being utilized. They kind of have an unexploited potential. Even though I talked earlier about how enriched the Mississippi River Basin is in nitrate, we found that these floodplains were still limited for nitrate. There's not enough groundwater coming in or not enough flooding to deliver nitrate frequently enough, where whenever we give these systems nitrate, they're responding pretty strongly. So as I mentioned earlier, when we gave nitrate, we saw a big jump in function. Also, as we were analyzing what predicted denitrification, we saw that denitrification tended to track with seasonal differences in riverine nitrate supply. So one of the recommendations that comes here is that these wetland systems and prairie systems are primed to treat nitrate, but we need to, as we're designing floodplains, get nitrate to them more often. And we measured denitrification potential, not an annualized mass balance, but kind of keep the math very simple with this high denitrification potential in these wetland systems, having more connectivity and that higher water table, more frequent flooding tends to have more nitrate delivered. We end up having more nitrate treated annually. So while we see maybe not the largest difference in denitrification potential between that prairie and that floodplain, with higher nitrate supply, we're seeing hopefully greater annualized nitrate treatment. So again, secondary controls were that hydrologic connectivity and nitrate supply. So the biggest difference we saw is that reestablishment of native vegetation. But if you do want to push your floodplain denitrification rates even higher, focusing on reestablishing wetland hydrology can be important. That might be choosing a site that is in a landscape position that already has a good groundwater connection or maybe is already flooding frequently and trying to put that into conservation and reestablish that native vegetation. That might also be focusing on modifying floodplain structure to improve that hydrologic connectivity. So instead of focusing on putting a lot of land in conservation, maybe it's focusing on having a floodplain that is more hydrologically connected that maybe has a higher investment, but we know is going to have a bit, from our evidence, going to have a bit higher treatment. So it's a bit of an overview. Thanks for listening, and I can take some questions now. I'll go ahead and flip to our next slide too.
All right. If you watch this webinar live and are wanting to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. Next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Only one survey response is needed for all 2024 webinars. The next one should be the webinar for next week. Okay, we're talking nitrogen again with Francois Bergan from North Carolina State University. Are we losing a lot of nitrogen during denitrification hot moments in agricultural soils? I'll just say, if you, Francois has as much energy as I've ever seen, so please tune in for that. I bet, Dani, you knew Francois when you were in North Carolina. Did you go to North Carolina State?
Yep, yeah, worked
Yep.
for him for a number of years. So yeah,
Okay.
can confirm. Definitely
Uh,
stop in for the energy.
Okay. Yep. All right. And oh, I think there maybe is one last slide. If you want to watch the archive of this webinar or any other Iowa Learning Farms webinar, you can go to the iowalearningfarms.org website, or we now have a YouTube page playlist with the Iowa Learning Farms webinars. Okay, Dani, we did get a couple questions here, and I'm going to take my prerogative as moderator to ask the first one. On the you mentioned in the floodplain wetland area that the artificial drainage was removed. Was that just removed in the floodplain area?
So, in the more intensive restoration, there was
Yeah.
artificial drainage that was removed. In
Okay.
the farm floodplain, there actually wasn't really any tiles at the time. So
Okay.
it's just that site. They went ahead and plugged and removed that, and the other sites didn't have it. So it's just the one more intensive restoration site had it was kind of a lower floodplain already. So they went ahead and removed that drainage as
Okay.
well.
Okay. Um, so another question in the agricultural testing areas, um, what kind of, I guess, was there tillage done there? No till, maybe what, you know, what some of the managements were?
At the time we were evaluating it, it was fall tillage and then no cover crops. So
Okay.
again, one of the big things is we were evaluating that organic matter. So it is being taken out. The soil is relatively unprotected during that flood season when we have that higher flows in the winter and spring. So there's some residue left, but very much exposed to soils in the winter for that system. So we didn't evaluate conservation practices on top of that. It could
Okay.
be interesting to think about, what's the intermediate between farming that floodplain and the prairie if you were to add some conservation practices on top of that.
Have you ever considered evaluating denitrification in areas with floodplain forests?
We just focused on prairie here.
Okay.
We had some adjacent forests, but didn't evaluate in that. Would be a great next thing to look at, but no, just focused on prairie vegetation, so mainly grasses and forbs there.
Okay. How do you measure or quantify the hydrologic connectivity?
Yeah, that was the piece that was challenging for us to do. There are a lot of metrics out there. When we think about what floodplain managers want, often things related to flood frequency, depth, duration are some of the metrics we're looking at. For this study, we used height above nearest drainage. So that's a vertical distance to the nearest drainage, as well as horizontal distance to the nearest drainage. We derived that from a digital elevation model. We also had a HECRAS 2D model here, and we were able to develop a number of velocity metrics from that. So we looked at velocity distribution, we looked at we tested things like median, mean velocity, 10th percentile flood velocity, 90th percentile. So not necessarily a connectivity piece, but kind of tells us a bit about the flow. And then we looked at days inundated. So we tried to capture how many days were inundated in the past month, 3 months, 6 months, and a year out from sampling from the system to try and figure out how inundation linked to that. We also did some studies that I didn't share here about number of days inundated and then tracking nitrate removal with that. So a range of things, but again, big challenge here is we really focused on more of that surface connectivity, and subsurface really seemed to play a role. So moving forward, having more groundwater data could be helpful, and some metrics to capture that below ground aspect of connectivity, because those wetter spots, even though they weren't getting that surface flooding as much, still had really high denitrification.
Okay. There are a couple kind of similar questions here. Is there any, maybe, sorry, jumped on me. Any particular native vegetation that you would recommend for increasing denitrification in floodplains and so forth?
So we're still working on that. We did some
Okay.
follow-up studies and focused a bit more on the wetland vegetation to figure out what was going on. We were able to identify some wetland vegetation that
Okay.
supported higher organic matter, and we're able to link it to some of the biochemical composition of vegetation. Still kind of working on that as well. So we don't have recommendations necessarily out yet in this study. Amaranth tended to have high denitrification, but was often located in ephemeral channels. So could be a geomorphic piece, could be the plant itself. Giant ragweed surprisingly had high denitrification, but tended to be in those wetland zones with kind of high sedimentation, high flow. So figuring out some of that work we're doing now is figuring out what plant properties are actually linked back to that denitrification, because this study we were limited with some conflicting variables to figure out why vegetation is high performing and separate it out from some of those geomorphic pieces.
There were a couple questions on reed canary grass and kind of how big a component that was, and maybe some of the denitrification potential of that reed canary grass.
Yeah, we saw high denitrification rates in reed canary grass. When we compare it to some other wetland vegetation and other studies, it's a little bit lower. The challenge is, even though it's high, it's a pretty aggressive invasive, so it's hard to make a recommendation, and probably shouldn't, to plant reed canary grass for high nitrogen treatment, but it happens to be one that does have high nitrogen treatment. As a perennial vegetation with a lot of above ground biomass, or below ground and above ground biomass, there's a lot of organic carbon going into the soil with that plant. But yeah, ends up being kind of a high performer, surprisingly, despite its kind of bad reputation as taking over things.
Can you talk a little bit more about the organic matter amendments that could potentially help to boost the denitrification potential?
Yeah, some restoration practices might bring in topsoil or maybe compost to start thinking about it. For a larger restoration site, it's often not maybe economically viable to bring in a lot of organic matter coming in. So there are some studies out there of making some additions ahead of time, trying to prep the soil a bit, but it is challenging. The larger you go with floodplain restoration and you're bringing in compost or topsoil, it gets very expensive. So that's where maybe picking a site where the organic matter stock hasn't been depleted as much might be a more economical choice in kind of having that higher denitrification. But yeah, I think scale would be a big challenge there, and adding some of those amendments, especially some of the larger sites we worked at, it could get pretty expensive pretty quickly.
All right. Did you consider the potential impacts of nutrient enrichment in wetlands, such as undesirable growth of duckweed or algae?
Didn't really focus on that piece as well.
Okay.
On some of the other work, we measured when you're having wetlands, what's the risk of releasing phosphorus? Because we know the wetter it is, sometimes that can trigger release of legacy phosphorus. So we did some work evaluating how do you manage this trade-off between nitrogen treatment in the wetland versus when we have that wetland hydrology releasing some other things. Didn't necessarily focus on the algae piece, but some of the work kind of shows in that wetland floodplain, we tend to have higher risk of phosphate release during flooding. But it's only a small fraction of the nitrogen removal. So we see much lower rates of phosphate release in that floodplain, even though it's a bit higher than some of the others.
Okay. I guess this one kind of gets back at the reed canary grass. Do we know if reed canary grass monoculture is as good as more diverse prairie vegetation for denitrification potential?
So how we characterize our plants were the dominant vegetation. So that might have been a single type of vegetation. In some of our plots, that was actually a quite mixed variety of vegetation. So we had some communities that were mixed grasses and forbs. And so with our data, it's tough to tell whether the mixture is better than the monoculture. Again, there are lots of complicating factors with this study because it is a bit more observational, where I don't think we have quite the granularity to say whether it makes more sense to have the monoculture piece or the more mixed. We had both. The mixed vegetation tended to be a high performer as well, but yeah, I don't think we can answer that quite yet. We're still digging into what about these different types of vegetation is really altering denitrification.
All right. Again, if folks need a CCA CEU, I think we've gotten most of the questions answered. So if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW @iastate.edu. Email her by 5 o'clock today with the name, your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, we have Francois from North Carolina State that's going to give the webinar next week about nitrogen hot moments. And with that, Dani, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Really important topic and lots of interest for sure. I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions. Feel free to reach out if you have more questions, if I can answer them about particular vegetation or some of those other functions. Happy to chat about how we can better restore floodplains. So thanks again.
All right.